After 35 years together, my husband looked me in the eye and said, "I never loved you." Those were the exact words. No stammering, no hesitation, just a flat sentence, delivered over lukewarm coffee and a half-eaten piece of toast on a Tuesday morning. My name is Marla Jensen. I was 62 years old when my husband of 35 years, the man I had built a home with, raised 2 children with, and devoted my adult life to, said those words as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. I remember the sunlight pouring through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the table, and how the dust danced in it like everything was perfectly normal, like nothing monumental had just broken inside me. I didn't say anything right away. My throat closed up. I tried to swallow, but the lump in my chest made it impossible. So I just stared at him. At the man I had met when I was 27. At Darren, who I thought was my partner, my person, my forever. I whispered, "What?" Not because I hadn't heard him. I had. I just needed him to take it back. I needed to give him the chance to say, "I didn't mean it," but instead he repeated it. Slower this time. "I never loved you, Marla. I thought I would. I thought eventually you'd be the one, but it never happened." I felt the walls of our kitchen start to close in. Everything I had believed about my life, my marriage, my family, my worth, felt like it was dissolving right there between the salt shaker and the butter dish. I don't remember crying in that moment. I think I was too shocked to cry. My brain started going in 1,000 directions at once. Was this about someone else? Was he sick? Was he punishing me for something I didn't know I'd done? But no, he didn't seem angry. He wasn't emotional at all, just distant, cold. Like this was something he'd practiced saying for years. I stood up, not even knowing where I was going. I made it to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. My face looked old, sagging in places I hadn't noticed before. My eyes were dull, exhausted, and I realized I had stopped seeing myself long before Darren had said it out loud. We hadn't kissed in months. He hadn't touched me in even longer. I thought maybe it was just what happens with age, with routine. But now, I saw it clearly. He had left emotionally a long time ago, and I had stayed, trying to hold together a house that was already ashes. For the next 7 days, I cried. Quietly, loudly, sometimes until I couldn't breathe. I stayed in the guest room. I didn't cook. I barely ate. I told my kids, Ethan and Clara, that I was just feeling under the weather. I couldn't bear to say the truth. I couldn't admit that my entire marriage had been built on a lie I didn't see coming. I kept waiting for Darren to say he regretted it, to take it back, to say, "I didn't mean it. I was angry, tired, frustrated." But he didn't. He went on with his days like nothing had happened. He watched his shows. He went to work. He slept soundly in the master bedroom while I lay awake night after night, replaying every year of our life together, wondering what was real and what was just convenient for him. And then, on the 8th day, something happened that would change everything. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more exciting stories. Before Darren shattered everything with a single sentence, I would have told you we had a good life. Not a perfect one, not a glamorous one, but a solid one. The kind of life that's built over decades, on routines, quiet rituals, and mutual understanding. At least, that's what I thought. I met Darren in 1987 at a 4th of July barbecue hosted by a mutual friend. He was charming, in a laid-back, slow-burn kind of way. I was still healing from a messy breakup, and Darren had this steady energy that made me feel safe. He was an accountant, not flashy, not wild, but kind, and kind felt like a miracle after what I'd been through. We married a year later. I wore my mother's wedding dress. We couldn't afford a big honeymoon, so we drove up the coast in a borrowed van, sleeping under the stars and laughing over gas station snacks. It was simple, beautiful. I remember thinking, this is what real love looks like. Not fireworks, but something warm and dependable. When we had our first child, Ethan, I decided to leave my job as a junior graphic designer and stay home. It wasn't even a question in my mind. Darren had just started at a new firm, and we agreed that someone needed to be fully present for our son. 2 years later, Clara came along. My hands were full, but my heart felt fuller. Our home wasn't perfect. There were tight months, broken appliances, tantrums, and tears, but I believed in what we were building. I made our house a home. Birthday banners, packed lunches, homemade Halloween costumes. I remembered everyone's appointments, celebrated every achievement, and held the family together like invisible glue. Darren worked long hours, but I didn't complain. I believed in us. I believed that we were a team. Sometimes when we were lying in bed at night, backs to each other but toes touching, I'd think, this is what love matures into. The fire fades, but the warmth stays. That's what people say, right? Looking back, I realize I gave him the best years of my life without ever stopping to ask if he actually saw me. And maybe that was my fault. I didn't demand much. I took pride in being low maintenance. I didn't need fancy vacations or designer handbags. I just wanted to be enough. We went on like that for years. Kids grew up. We moved to a smaller house. He started golfing more. I started volunteering at the library. Our conversations became logistical. Groceries, bills, who was picking up Clara from the airport. But again, I thought that was just normal after 3 decades together. On anniversaries, we'd go out to dinner. He always forgot to make reservations, so we'd end up waiting at the bar. I'd tease him about it. He'd laugh. We'd split dessert. I'd come home thinking, he may not be romantic, but at least he shows up. But now, I see it differently. He wasn't showing up. He was coasting, and I was mistaking his presence for partnership. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd shrunk down just to fit inside the margins of his life. How many times I swallowed my feelings to keep the peace. How often I let my own dreams dissolve in the background while I cheered him on, supported the kids, and kept everything running. There were no big fights, no betrayals that I could point to, just years of small silences, skipped kisses, half-hearted compliments, and a growing distance I convinced myself was normal. When he told me he never loved me, it wasn't just the sentence that broke me. It was the realization that I had been living in a story I had written by myself, and he hadn't even bothered to read it. I had believed in us, fully, deeply, blindly, and that belief, that beautiful, devastating belief, made the fall even harder. I used to believe that love disappeared with a bang, some dramatic betrayal, some scandalous reveal, but in my case, it faded like wallpaper in the sun, quietly, gradually, without anyone noticing, especially me. The first time I felt it, that off feeling, was on a Sunday afternoon about 5 years ago. Darren had come home from golf later than usual. I was in the kitchen preparing a roast, wearing an apron Clara had embroidered for me back in high school. It still made me smile every time I tied it around my waist. I greeted him with a cheerful, "Hey babe, you hungry?" He barely glanced at me. "Already ate with the guys," he muttered, walking past me to the living room. No kiss, no eye contact, no warmth. I stood there holding the carving knife, staring at the table I'd just set. Mashed potatoes, homemade rolls, candles. It wasn't a special occasion. I just liked doing nice things. I liked making our home feel full. But in that moment, it felt absurd, like I was staging a dinner for someone who didn't even show up to the play. Still, I brushed it off. Told myself he was tired, that golf had run long, that maybe he wasn't feeling well. But once that moment lodged itself in my chest, I started noticing others. There was the time we were at a friend's retirement party, and someone asked Darren how we met. He laughed and said, "Oh, I don't even remember. She probably chased me down." He meant it as a joke. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but I felt something cold unfurling in my stomach. I had always loved telling our story. That barbecue, the slow dances in the garage to old records. But now, he didn't even pretend it mattered. Then there was my birthday. Not the milestone one, just a quiet 61. I didn't expect much. I wasn't one for grand celebrations, but I figured maybe dinner, a card, something. Instead, he handed me an envelope with a $50 gift card to a generic department store. No note, no hug, just, "Here, thought you could use this." I stared at it for a long time after he walked away, not because I cared about the gift, but because of the emptiness in it. It was the kind of gift you give a coworker or a stranger. And I wondered when exactly I had become both. Still, I told myself not to make it into something. Don't be dramatic, Marla. He's a quiet man. He's not into gestures. He provides. He shows love in different ways. That was my mantra. But the truth? Deep down, I started to feel like a guest in my own marriage, like a housekeeper who knew his schedule, stocked his favorite snacks, ironed his shirts, but who he stopped seeing a long time ago. The worst part? I blamed myself. I told myself I wasn't trying hard enough, that maybe I had gained a little weight, that maybe I talked too much about the kids or didn't dress up like I used to. I started second-guessing every interaction, every word. I wondered if I was boring, if I'd become a burden. I didn't say any of this out loud. Not to Leona, not to my kids, not even to Darren. I kept it all inside because I was terrified that if I said it, it would become real. That the cracks I was seeing weren't just in my imagination, but in the very foundation of the life I'd spent decades building. That was the first red flag. A cold dinner, a dismissive laugh, a forgotten birthday. Small things, but small things become splinters. And over time, they burrow deeper, until one day they pierce something vital. And by then, you're already bleeding. It's strange how a person can be in the same house as you, breathe the same air, sleep beside you each night, and still feel like a ghost. That's what I became in my own home. After the red flags, things didn't explode. There were no screaming matches, no ultimatums, no door-slamming dramatics, just silence. Heavy, humming silence that grew louder with each passing day. I'd wake up and make coffee. Darren would already be gone, sometimes without saying a word. He started going into the office earlier, or so he said. I stopped waiting for him to come home at a reasonable hour. I stopped asking questions. He didn't seem to see me anymore. Not really. When we did talk, it was about logistics, bills, groceries, the gutter that needed fixing. But not about us. Never about us. One night, I sat down beside him on the couch while he watched a documentary. I reached over and gently put my hand on his knee. He flinched. Just a little. Barely noticeable. But I noticed. Then he cleared his throat and said, "I'm tired, Marla," before getting up and going to bed. I sat there alone, the TV still flickering, my hand still resting where his had been. That's when it hit me. I had become uncomfortable to him, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my presence reminded him of a closeness he no longer wanted. And I started to vanish. Not physically. I still cleaned the house, still did the laundry, still managed the appointments, still texted the kids to check in. But emotionally, I was disappearing one day at a time. He didn't ask about my headaches. He didn't notice when I got my hair cut. He didn't thank me when I made his favorite casserole. The man who once used to hold my face in his hands and call me a safe place now walked past me in the hallway like I was part of the wallpaper. And it wasn't just Darren. The erosion of my identity started to seep into every corner of my life. Clara called less often. Ethan was busy with his own family. Leona asked me to come to lunch, but I kept finding excuses. I didn't want to talk about how fine things were. I didn't want to pretend I wasn't slowly unraveling. I started questioning everything. I'd look in the mirror and not recognize the woman staring back. Tired eyes, gray roots, skin that seemed to have lost its light. I wondered if I'd become dull, if I'd made myself too easy to forget, if I'd somehow asked for this by being too available, too agreeable, too safe. I tried to fix things the only way I knew how, quietly, patiently. I left little notes in Darren's briefcase. I planned a weekend getaway to the cabin he used to love. I even bought a new nightgown, soft blue with lace trim, hoping he'd look at me the way he used to. He didn't notice the notes. He canceled the cabin trip, said he had meetings, and when I walked into the bedroom wearing that nightgown, He didn't even look up from his phone. That night, I lay awake and thought, this is what slow death feels like. Because it was a death, not of my body, but of my identity, of my role as a wife, a partner, a woman worth showing up for. I was living in the same house, following the same routines, speaking the same language, but it was all background noise to him. And eventually, I stopped trying. I stopped leaving notes. I stopped planning anything. I stopped reaching out. I let the silence settle, and in that silence, I realized something even more painful than being unloved. I had spent years disappearing to make space for someone who never asked me to be whole in the first place. I was lonely. Not the kind of lonely you feel in an empty house. The kind you feel while sitting 2 feet away from someone who no longer sees you. And worse, I had started to believe I deserved it. It was supposed to be a celebration. Darren's firm had won a regional award for community leadership, and they were throwing a party at one of those upscale rooftop bars, the kind with string lights, signature cocktails, and a view that made everyone feel more important than they really were. He didn't even mention the event until 2 days before. Just casually said, "You can come if you want. It's mostly work people." If you want, not I want you there. Not it would mean a lot, just indifferent permission. I spent that whole afternoon getting ready, even though I was already worn down to a thread. I curled my hair for the first time in months, wore a navy dress that I hadn't had a reason to wear in years. I even put on the perfume Darren had once said reminded him of when we first met. A tiny foolish part of me thought maybe, just maybe, tonight could shift something. I was wrong. The moment we arrived, he detached. He floated off to the bar with a group of younger associates, barely introducing me to anyone. I stood there awkwardly, holding a glass of water and smiling at strangers, trying to look like I belonged, like I hadn't just been left standing alone by the man who was supposed to be proud to have me on his arm. Eventually, one of Darren's colleagues, a junior partner named Brian, maybe 10 years younger than me, struck up small talk. He was polite, asking how long Darren and I had been together. 35 years, I said with a smile, even though my voice caught in my throat. Since 1988. He raised his eyebrows, genuinely impressed. Wow, that's rare these days. Before I could respond, Darren appeared beside us. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd sense me feeling out of place and come to check on me. But then, without looking at me, he chuckled and said, 35 years? More like a hostage situation. My heart dropped. Brian laughed awkwardly. I forced a smile, that tight, frozen kind that feels like it's strangling you. Darren didn't even glance at me, just took a sip of his drink and continued talking like I wasn't there. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't. I was invisible. Worse than invisible. I was the punchline. I excused myself and went to the restroom, locking the stall door behind me before the tears came. Not loud sobs, just silent, shaking tears that spilled before I could stop them. I sat on the toilet seat, trembling, wiping my face with cheap paper towels and whispering to myself, "Pull it together, Marla. Just get through the night." But something inside me cracked. That joke, that cruel, dismissive line, wasn't just a joke. It was a truth he had finally stopped hiding. He saw me as a burden, a mistake he'd endured, a life he felt stuck in, and he had said it in front of strangers without flinching. When I came back out, the music seemed louder, the lights too bright. Everything was a blur. I saw him laughing at the bar, fully in his element, surrounded by colleagues who thought he was charming and solid and successful. None of them knew the man who came home and ignored me. The man who hadn't kissed me in over a year. The man who forgot my birthday, dismissed my thoughts, and left me to shrink until I barely recognized my own reflection. I stayed another 20 minutes, long enough to avoid questions, long enough to make it look like I was okay. But inside, I wasn't okay. I was humiliated, and not just by his words, but by my own silence, my own desperate hope that if I just kept loving him, kept showing up, kept smiling, maybe he'd come back to me. That night, as we drove home in silence, something shifted permanently. I looked out the window and thought, I don't know who I am to him anymore. I don't know who I am to myself anymore. But I knew one thing for sure. I could never unhear those words, and I would never forget how small they made me feel. The morning after the rooftop party, I didn't get out of bed right away. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying Darren's words in my head over and over again. 35 years. More like a hostage situation. I could still hear the forced laughter of his colleague, the tightness in my chest as I stood alone in that bright, echoing bathroom, wiping mascara from my face with scratchy paper towels. Darren got up early as usual. I heard him moving around in the closet, then the front door closing. No goodbye, no mention of the night before, nothing. That silence, that terrible, indifferent silence, was louder than any screaming match could have been. I got up and made coffee, out of habit more than anything. As the machine gurgled and hissed, I stared at the two mugs hanging on the rack. One said, "Mr. Always Right," and the other, "Mrs. Always Right" behind him. It used to be a cute joke between us. Now, it felt like a prophecy I had unknowingly fulfilled. After breakfast, I opened the linen closet and pulled out my suitcase. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. Not yet. I moved slowly, methodically. I packed jeans, cardigans, a few dresses, my mother's locket, the framed photo of Ethan and Clara as toddlers at the beach, the one I used to keep on my nightstand. I didn't take everything, just what I needed to feel like me, whoever that even was anymore. The hardest part was leaving behind the memories. The kitchen table where Clara did her homework, the porch swing where Darren and I used to sit in the early years, holding hands in silence, the closet that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets I'd made myself, the bedroom with its worn comforter and untouched space between our pillows. By noon, I had everything in the car. I sat behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the house. My house. The one I had poured myself into for decades. I planted every flower in the garden, painted every room, folded laundry in that sunlit corner of the living room while the kids watched cartoons. I knew every creaky floorboard, every hidden scuff mark behind the couch, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place where I had become invisible. I didn't leave with rage. I didn't scream or slam the door or throw plates like they do in the movies. I left the way people do when they've already spent too long begging for scraps. Quiet, numb, hollow. I didn't even leave a note. What was there left to say? I drove to my sister Leona's house. She lived 30 minutes away, just outside the city. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with a suitcase, her smile dropped. "Marla," she whispered. "I can't do it anymore," I said, my voice breaking for the first time. And just like that, the dam inside me gave way. I collapsed into her arms, sobbing, shaking, unable to hold it in any longer. Every emotion I had buried, the humiliation, the grief, the disbelief, came pouring out. She didn't ask questions. She just held me. Later that night, she made tea and sat beside me on the couch. I told her everything. The party, the years of distance, the cold truth Darren had dropped like it meant nothing. "I never loved you." She listened with tears in her eyes. "You didn't deserve that," she said quietly. "You gave him everything." And that was the part that hurt the most. I had given him everything. My loyalty, my body, my youth, my time. I had made excuses, filled the silences, kept the ship afloat when he let go of the wheel. I had built a life around him, only to discover he'd never really been in it with me. Everyone always thought of me as the strong one, the dependable one, the one who always kept it together. But that night, in my sister's guest room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her old furnace, I didn't feel strong. I felt abandoned, discarded, erased, and somewhere, beneath all the numbness, a small voice inside me whispered, "They all think you'll stay broken." I didn't know it then, but that voice would become the seed of something else entirely. Something stronger. Rock bottom doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come crashing in like a storm. It settles in slowly, like fog. You don't even realize how lost you are until you can't see the road in front of you anymore. For me, rock bottom came in whispers. It came in the morning. I didn't brush my hair because I had nowhere to go. It came in the 2-day-old tea sitting on my nightstand. It came in the voicemail from Ethan that I didn't return because I didn't want to hear the politeness in his voice, instead of real concern. It came in the ache I felt when I realized Clara hadn't called in over a week. At first, staying with Leona felt like a break, like I had stepped off a sinking ship. But that relief didn't last. Within days, the silence became unbearable. The noises were different. The smells unfamiliar. I didn't feel like myself in her guest room. And the worst part? I didn't feel like myself anywhere. I didn't know who I was outside of being Darren's wife. Even after all the pain, all the neglect, all the erasure, I still felt like I'd lost something precious. Not because it had real value, but because I had held on to it for so long. I had built a whole identity around holding it together, around keeping a man who had never truly seen me from falling apart. Now that he was gone, or rather, that I was, I didn't know what to hold anymore. I'd wake up late, sometimes after 10, and sit in the same armchair by the window for hours. I wouldn't eat until Leona got home and asked if I'd had lunch. Most days, I hadn't. I was just too tired, not physically, but emotionally. Tired in that bone-deep, soul-level way that no nap can fix. I watched TV but couldn't follow the plots. I flipped through books but couldn't absorb the words. I stared at my phone screen for hours, typing messages and deleting them, unsure of what I even wanted to say. The loneliness was suffocating, not just the kind that comes from being physically alone, but the kind that creeps in when you realize no one really knows what you're going through. People kept telling me how strong I was, how brave I was for leaving. But I didn't feel brave. I felt broken, like I'd been hollowed out and left to echo. One night, I went for a walk, just to get some air, to feel something other than the dull weight in my chest. I ended up at a park near Leona's place. It was mostly empty, except for a teenage couple on a bench, giggling and sharing earbuds. I sat down on a swing and stared at the gravel below me, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. I started to cry. Not the kind of crying I'd done before. Not angry, not hurt, not even sad. Just a slow, steady weeping that felt like it had been waiting years to escape. I cried for the years I gave to a man who never loved me. I cried for the version of myself I had abandoned. I cried for the mother I had tried to be, the woman I thought I was, the love I thought I'd earned. I cried because I had no idea what came next, and because for the first time in my adult life, no one was coming to save me. That was the lowest moment. Sitting alone in a public park at night, crying on a swing like a forgotten child, I realized something terrifying. No one was watching. No one was keeping track. No one knew how deep the emptiness had gotten. It was just me. But there's something strange about hitting the absolute bottom. Once you're there, with nothing left to lose, nothing left to pretend, and no one left to perform for, a strange sort of clarity starts to emerge. And for me, that clarity came in the form of a dusty old shoebox buried beneath a pile of blankets in the back of Leona's closet. I wasn't looking for anything when I found it. Leona had asked me to help her clear out the linen closet. She was on one of her let's organize everything kicks, and honestly, I was grateful for the distraction. We were folding sheets and sorting old pillowcases when I reached for a tattered quilt pushed deep into the top shelf. Something fell behind it with a soft thud. It was a shoebox, old, worn, covered in faded stickers of butterflies and daisies, the kind my mother used to decorate things with back in the 90s. My breath caught as soon as I saw it. I recognized it instantly. My mother had given it to me a year before she passed away. "You'll know when it's time to open it," she'd said. At the time, I laughed and told her she sounded like she was casting a spell. She smiled that secret, knowing smile of hers and tucked it into my hands like it held something sacred. I had completely forgotten about it. Back then, life was chaotic. Darren had just been laid off, Ethan had broken his arm skateboarding, and Clara was failing calculus. I'd slipped the box into a bag of winter linens and told myself I'd look at it later. Later became a year, then 5, then 20, until now. I sat down on the bedroom floor and placed the box in my lap. It felt heavier than I remembered, not physically, but emotionally. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lavender and dust. There were a few photographs. One of me as a little girl standing next to my mother's garden, another of her holding me at my college graduation, a few yellowed letters tied together with ribbon, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope marked in her handwriting, "For when you forget who you are." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letter inside was handwritten in the same elegant cursive she used on birthday cards and recipe notes. Just seeing her words again brought tears to my eyes. But it wasn't a letter filled with sentimentality. It was truth. Raw, real, and meant for a moment just like this. She wrote about how she, too, had once been the woman who kept everything running, who smiled through disappointment, who stayed quiet to keep the peace. She wrote about the loneliness that came from loving someone who didn't know how to love back, about how long it took her to stop blaming herself for someone else's emotional distance. And then she wrote this: "You are not a reflection of the way someone else fails to love. You are not invisible. You are not weak. You are not small. You are my daughter, and that alone makes you enough." I broke. Not from sadness, but from recognition. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. Not by Darren, not by Ethan or Clara, but by the woman who had raised me, who had known this moment would come even before I did, who had reached through time to wrap her arms around me. That letter felt like someone turning on a light in a room I thought I'd never find the door to. I stayed up all night rereading it. I laid out the old photos on the bed like puzzle pieces of a woman I used to be, one with fire, with ambition, with a voice that hadn't yet been softened by decades of compromise. That night, I didn't cry the way I had before. It wasn't grief this time. It was something else. It was remembrance of who I used to be, of what I had survived, of what still lived inside me. Buried, yes, but never gone. That letter didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years or mend the heartbreak, but it reminded me of something I had long forgotten. That I existed before Darren, that I had a story before he entered the frame, and that I still had chapters left to write. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden moment where I stood tall, ripped off the metaphorical bandage, and declared I was a new woman. That's not how healing works. Not real healing, anyway. It starts small, quiet, almost invisible. It began the next morning. I woke up earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen. The world outside the window was still gray, the kind of soft light that makes everything look gentle, even the broken parts. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel dread. I didn't feel hope either. What I felt was readiness, a readiness to stop floating and put my feet back on the ground. I started by making my bed. It seems silly now how monumental that felt, but I hadn't made a bed in weeks. Not since I left Darren, not since I left the version of myself who made beds, packed lunches, folded laundry with scented dryer sheets, and waited for validation that never came. That morning, I smoothed the sheets, fluffed the pillows, pulled the comforter tight, and I whispered to myself, "This is your space now. No one gets to define it but you." Later that day, I opened my laptop, the one I hadn't touched since I left home, and pulled up the folder labeled Portfolio. It was dusty with digital cobwebs, old logo mock-ups, unfinished illustrations, a children's book concept I had sketched years ago and never shared. I clicked through them like I was meeting a past version of myself I hadn't spoken to in ages. And I realized she still lived in there, the creative woman. The woman with an eye for detail and color and story. The woman who used to dream of starting her own design studio before she let herself become too busy being everyone else's everything. That afternoon, I walked to a small cafe around the corner from Leona's house. I ordered a tea and brought my sketchbook. I sat by the window and just drew. Nothing fancy, just the people walking by. A crooked little houseplant on the windowsill, the barista's messy bun. But it felt like reclaiming something, like pressing my fingers back into the clay of my own life. Over the next week, I started rebuilding, not loudly, not for anyone else to see, just for me. I made a spreadsheet of small design clients I'd worked with years ago and sent a few tentative emails. I updated my LinkedIn profile, something I hadn't touched since Clara was in high school. I bought a new set of watercolors. I walked every day, even when my legs felt heavy. I read the letter from my mother again and again and again, and slowly the fog began to lift. I didn't feel powerful, not yet, but I did feel present. And after weeks of numbness, that alone was a triumph. One night, I stood in front of the mirror and really looked at myself. Not through the lens of what Darren had failed to see, not through the judgment of years gone by, just me. My skin was softer, yes. My hair had more gray. My eyes carried stories that no one else knew. But for the first time in a long time, I saw a woman who had survived. A woman who had been pushed to the edge of erasure, and instead of disappearing, had chosen to reappear. I didn't know exactly what the future held. I didn't have a grand plan or a 5-year vision board. But I had a new kind of hunger. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for myself. To see what I could become when I wasn't trying to be someone else's idea of enough. That letter didn't just remind me of who I was. It gave me permission to begin again. Something changed in me after that letter, and not in a loud, dramatic way. I didn't storm back into Darren's life demanding apologies. I didn't post poetic affirmations online. I didn't tell Ethan or Clara that I had found a shoebox that had cracked open my soul. Instead, I got quiet. But that quiet was powerful. I started moving in a way that felt like reclaiming my life, not for revenge, but for dignity. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't need to. This part wasn't about performance or permission. It was about preparing, for freedom, for peace, for me. The first thing I did was get a copy of our marriage license and financial records. Leona's neighbor, a retired legal secretary named Valerie, helped me sort through them. She didn't ask why. She just highlighted important lines and handed me paper clips and Post-its, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I opened a new checking account in my name only. It was small at first, just what was left from the birthday money my late aunt had sent me the year before, plus a little I'd quietly transferred out of the joint account before I left Darren. Enough for a few bills, enough to make me feel real. Then came the emails. I reached out to 3 former clients, women I had worked with years ago on logos and brand kits back when I was freelancing in between the kids' schedules and Darren's work chaos. I didn't pitch anything fancy. I just said, I'm taking on small design work again, if you know anyone looking. 2 of them responded within a day. One of them, a woman named Sarah, who ran a small handmade jewelry business, wrote, I've been hoping you'd come back to this. I still get compliments on the logo you made. Can I book you for a website refresh? That message stayed open on my screen for 10 minutes before I answered it. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed to let myself feel what it meant. Someone still saw value in me, and not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a placeholder or afterthought, as me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't starting over. I was returning to the woman I had been before I gave all my energy away, before I believed that being invisible was part of being good. I spent the next week building a simple portfolio site, nothing fancy, just enough to showcase a few projects and say, here I am, I exist. I didn't tell Darren. He still texted sometimes, always short messages. Any updates from Clara? Still getting mail here. We should talk sometime. I ignored most of them. I wasn't ready. Not to explain myself, not to rehash things, not to offer emotional labor to a man who had already taken so much from me. I also didn't tell my kids, not yet. They were polite, distant. Ethan checked in every now and then. Clara barely responded to my messages. I didn't want to come to them from a place of brokenness. I wanted to show them, when the time was right, what healing could look like. One evening, I stood at the kitchen counter in Leona's house and wrote down a list. At the top, I wrote, what I can control. Below that, I wrote my schedule, my finances, my words, my healing, my boundaries, my name. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning. The most important thing I did that month? I hired a lawyer, quietly, carefully. A woman named Camila, who had a reputation for handling separation cases with dignity and precision. I told her I wasn't looking for war, just fairness. A clean line, a fresh start. Camila said something I'll never forget. Quiet women aren't weak, they're just gathering their strength. That stuck with me. So I gathered mine. Without noise, without spectacle, without asking anyone if it was okay, and brick by quiet brick. I began to build the life that no one could take from me again. It didn't happen overnight. There was no grand reveal, no headlines, no dramatic fallout, just a series of small, undeniable shifts, like the tide quietly pulling back from a shore that had long taken its waves for granted. The first shift came through my daughter, Clara. We hadn't spoken much since I left Darren. Our conversations, when they happened, were short, surface level. She never asked what really happened, never pushed. I knew she was close with Darren. He'd always been more emotionally available to her than he ever was to me. That stung, but I never held it against her. But about a month after I moved out, she texted, "Hey Mom, Dad told me you're staying at Aunt Leona's. Just checking in. You okay?" It wasn't much, but it was something. I replied simply, "I'm okay, taking it one step at a time." She responded with a heart emoji, and then a day later, a second message. "Do you need anything?" For the first time, I didn't say, "No, I'm fine." I wrote, "Thanks, just your support. That means more than you know." She didn't reply right away, but 2 days later, she called. And I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Uncertainty. Not about me, about him. "He told me you just left," she said quietly. Didn't really explain much. I didn't attack him, I didn't vent, I just told the truth. Plainly, calmly. I left because I finally realized he hadn't loved me for a long time, and I needed to learn how to love myself again. There was a pause. Then gently, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because I didn't know how. Because I didn't want you to think less of him. Because I thought being strong meant staying silent. But instead, I said, I'm saying it now." That conversation wasn't a turning point between us, but it cracked something open. Clara started calling more, just to chat, to check in, to ask for my opinion, like she used to. And then came the shift with Ethan. He called one afternoon, clearly flustered. "Hey, Dad asked if I could help him figure out his taxes this year," he said. "He said you used to do most of that stuff." I smiled. "That's true. And now he's kind of lost," he added. I didn't gloat. I didn't take pleasure in it. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a tiny flicker of satisfaction. Because for years, I'd managed so many parts of Darren's life without credit. His appointments, our finances, his prescriptions. I had been the invisible scaffolding holding up his world. Now, without me, it was starting to tilt. Ethan went quiet for a second, then he asked, "So, what are you doing now? Like, with your time?" It was such a simple question, but I felt something in my chest rise. I told him about the freelance work, about the website I was building, about the watercolor workshop I was thinking of taking. "Wow," he said. "That's really cool, Mom." He sounded surprised, and I didn't resent that. I understood why. For most of his life, I had only ever been Mom, stable, predictable, a constant presence in the background. Now I was becoming a person again. A few days later, Darren emailed me. Just one line. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time. Not because I wanted to respond, but because I didn't feel the urgency anymore. The ache, the need for closure. His words didn't carry power over me now. They didn't shake me. They didn't make me question my worth, and I think, deep down, he knew that. Because when power begins to shift, it's not about taking control, it's about no longer needing it from anyone else. I didn't answer his email. Not because I was being cruel, but because I had already had the conversation with myself that mattered most. I had said, "You are enough. You are always enough." And now, the world was beginning to reflect that truth back to me, piece by piece. I agreed to meet him, not because I needed to, but because I was ready. Darren had sent 3 more messages after that first email. The last one said simply, "Please, just one conversation. That's all I'm asking." There was something in the tone that had shifted, not arrogance, not indifference, something closer to discomfort, or maybe regret. Leona asked if I was sure. I was. Not because I wanted to reopen old wounds, but because I finally trusted myself not to bleed from them anymore. We met at a small cafe halfway between our old house and where I was staying. A quiet place with mismatched chairs and dusty books on a shelf near the register. I got there first and chose a table by the window. Not the kind you hide in, the kind you face the world from. When Darren walked in, I was struck by how familiar and unfamiliar he looked at the same time. Same coat, same tired eyes, but something about him felt smaller. Maybe he had always been that small. I just used to look up at him. He sat down across from me and offered a quick, nervous smile. "Thanks for meeting me," he said. I nodded. "You asked. I came." He looked around as if searching for words. Then finally he said, "I've been thinking a lot." I let the silence hang. He continued, "I didn't expect you to leave. I guess I thought you never would." That hit me, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something I had always feared, that he'd built our life on the assumption that I would never choose myself. "I almost didn't," I said, but then I realized staying wasn't love. It was self-erasure. He nodded slowly, clearly not understanding, but trying to act like he did. "I know I wasn't good to you," he said, "but I didn't think it was that bad." I tilted my head. "You told me you never loved me, Darren. You said it like you were commenting on the weather." He looked down at his hands, ashamed. But I didn't come for shame. I didn't come for an apology. I came for truth. And I already had mine. "I was angry that day," he muttered. "Frustrated." I shook my head. "No, you were honest. Don't take that back now. Own it. I needed to hear it." He looked up at me, surprised. Maybe he expected rage, bitterness, but all I gave him was clarity. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," I said. "Not closure, not forgiveness, not even understanding." "Then why did you come?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "To look you in the eye and show you what survival looks like." He blinked, confused. "I'm doing fine," I said. "I have clients, I've got a new place, I'm building something. For myself, this time. And I'm not here to punish you, Darren. That would still mean I'm carrying you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, in the smallest voice I'd ever heard from him, he asked, "Do you think I'm a bad person?" I looked out the window for a beat before answering. "I think you're a man who mistook comfort for love, who thought silence was easier than honesty, and who forgot that the person holding everything together had limits too." He nodded, eyes downcast. We sat in silence, the kind that used to hurt but now felt like freedom. Then I stood up, gathered my things, and said one final thing before I left. "I don't hate you, but I've stopped needing anything from you. And that's the most peaceful thing I've ever known." As I walked out, the air felt crisper, lighter. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt whole, because power isn't always about taking something back. Sometimes it's about knowing you don't need it anymore. 2 weeks after that cafe meeting, a letter arrived in the mail. It was hand-addressed, in cursive I didn't recognize, and postmarked from Colorado, where my mother's attorney Walter had lived for decades before he retired. I hadn't heard from his office since her estate was settled all those years ago. I assumed it was a clerical error, some leftover legal notice. I almost tossed it. But something about the weight of the envelope, the precision of the penmanship, the familiar, careful tone, made me sit down and open it. Inside was a short letter, neatly typed, from Walter's daughter who had taken over his small practice. Her message was direct. Your mother left a sealed addendum to her will with instructions that it be delivered in the event of your legal separation from Darren Jensen. It remained unopened in our archives until your recent filing, which was finalized this month. Please find enclosed the document, as per her wishes. My hands trembled as I read the enclosed letter. This one, written in my mother's unmistakable script, yellowed slightly with age. It began simply, "If you are reading this, then you've found your way out, and I want to give you something to walk forward with." I had to stop reading and put my hand over my mouth. It felt like she had reached through time again, just like she did with the shoebox, always knowing I would one day need her strength more than anyone else's. She went on, "I watched you love Darren for years. I watched how much you gave, how little you asked for. I didn't say anything, because I knew you wouldn't have heard me. Not yet. But I did something in case you ever found your way back to yourself." The letter explained that she had quietly placed a portion of her inheritance into a private account in my name, something I never knew existed. Not massive, but substantial. Enough to buy a home, enough to restart a career, enough to stand up and never look back. But the condition? That I leave Darren. Not out of malice, out of self-recognition. She wrote, "I didn't want you to settle the way I did. I wanted you to remember that you came from women who endured, but who deserved more than endurance. I wanted to reward you not for leaving a man, but for choosing yourself." I sat there for a long time, stunned, as if I'd been handed a second chance by a ghost. It wasn't just about the money. It was what it represented. That someone I loved, someone who saw me, had prepared for this moment, had believed it would come, had trusted that I would eventually find the strength to walk through it. And now I was being given more than a financial cushion. I was being given validation. Everything Darren tried to reduce me to, convenient, quiet, unremarkable, was undone in that moment. I spent the next few days working with Camilla, my lawyer, to separate finances fully. I didn't need anything from Darren now, not even fairness. I had my own. When the account was fully transferred, I used part of it to put a down payment on a modest cottage in a coastal town I'd visited once in my 20s, a place with a quiet artist community, a small bookstore, a farmer's market every Sunday. When I told Leona, she cried. "Mom would be so proud," she whispered, "not because you left, but because you finally let yourself live. And that's the truth of it. This twist, this final justice, wasn't about Darren losing something. It was about me reclaiming everything. My name, my space, my purpose, my peace. And in the end, it was my mother, long gone but never truly absent, who handed me the key. It had been nearly 4 months since I left Darren when I got the message from Clara. She hadn't texted in over a week. We were still rebuilding, still figuring out what our relationship looked like when it wasn't filtered through holiday dinners and polite check-ins. But this message was different. "Can I come visit?" she wrote. "I want to talk, just us." I stared at those words for a long time. Part of me flinched. Another part softened. I hadn't told Clara about the trust, or the house, or even that I'd officially moved. She didn't know about the art studio I'd set up in the sunroom, or the website clients I'd started working with, or the community center where I was helping organize a women's retreat. I hadn't told her because I wasn't sure she wanted to hear it, or if she could yet see me outside of the lens of Mom the helper, Mom the stable one, Mom who always made things easy. But still, I said yes. She arrived that Saturday afternoon. It was a cool, breezy day by the coast, and I had set out fresh lemonade and 2 glasses on the porch, unsure what to expect. When she stepped out of the car, I saw her pause, just for a moment, taking in the cottage, the flower boxes, the quiet peace of it all. "You really did it," she said as she hugged me. "You made a new life." We sat on the porch and talked for over an hour. At first, it was just small things. Her work, Ethan's kids, her cat who kept chewing through charging cords. Then slowly the conversation dipped into deeper waters. I didn't know how bad it was, she said quietly, staring at her hands. I didn't let you know, I replied. I didn't even let myself know for a long time. Clara nodded and her eyes began to shine. I feel guilty, like I should have noticed, like I failed you. I reached across the table and took her hand. You didn't fail me. I disappeared so gradually, even I didn't see it happening. She looked at me with the kind of vulnerability she hadn't shown since she was a teenager. I think part of me didn't want to see it, because it meant admitting the version of Dad I loved wasn't real, or at least, not whole. There it was. The thing I'd been waiting for, not in expectation, but in hope. The acknowledgement, not of blame, but of truth. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. You're not losing me, I said. But you are meeting a version of me you've never known, a version I'm still getting to know myself. She smiled, teary but genuine. She seemed strong. I think I like her. We laughed, and for the first time it felt like we were two women meeting on equal footing. Not mother and daughter bound by duty, but human beings choosing to know each other all over again. Before she left, she asked something I didn't expect. Would it be okay if I visited again? Maybe even stayed for a weekend sometime? I hesitated for a moment. Not because I didn't want her there, but because I had learned something in my solitude. People could return, but I no longer needed them to. And in that, I had found my power. I'd love that, I said, as long as you know this isn't the old version of me you're visiting. This is my space, my life, and you're welcome here, as long as it's real. Clara hugged me tightly. That's exactly what I want. As I watched her drive away, I didn't feel the ache I used to feel every time someone I loved pulled out of a driveway, because I no longer saw departure as abandonment. I saw it as choice, and I knew, no matter who stayed or left, I would no longer lose myself trying to be loved. Some mornings, I wake up before the sun and just listen. Not for footsteps, not for someone calling my name, not for needs I need to fill or silence I need to break. I listen for the stillness and the way it finally feels like mine. I live in a small cottage now, nestled just a short walk from the ocean, the kind of place I used to dream about when I was younger, but told myself I could never afford or didn't deserve. The walls are painted soft cream. The kitchen has mismatched mugs I chose one at a time. There are books stacked everywhere and watercolor palettes on the windowsill. And in the back, there's a garden I planted myself. Tomatoes, lavender, snapdragons. Things that grow slowly but surely like I did. Sometimes I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and just breathe. There's no noise from a television I'm not watching, no dry conversation about golf scores or dinner plans, just air. Wind. A horizon that stretches farther than my old life ever allowed me to see. Darren and I never spoke again after that cafe meeting. He sent one more message after the divorce was finalized, just a short, vague line. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I had nothing left to say. The story we shared had already ended. I just happened to be the only one who stayed for the credits. I've realized now that forgiveness doesn't always come with a conversation. Sometimes it comes when you stop needing someone to understand the pain they caused. Clara visits more often now. She brings pastries and talks about her job, her friends, her doubts. She doesn't pretend anymore. She asks me questions she never asked before, like, do you ever want to fall in love again? And I tell her the truth. I'm still figuring out what it means to love myself completely. And that's a full-time job. Ethan's quieter, but his voice is warmer when he calls. He sends me links to articles about design trends, tells me how proud he is that I went back to it. He never says it outright, but I can hear it in his voice. He sees me differently now, not just as mom, but as someone who rebuilt from nothing. And me? I've stopped measuring my days by how much I gave to others. I measure them now by how much I showed up for myself. The final piece of my transformation came not with a bang, but with a whisper. One night, I was going through a box of my old sketchbooks and found a single page from years ago, a doodle of a woman standing on a cliff, arms open, wind pulling at her clothes. Underneath it, I had written, "She didn't jump, she learned to fly." At the time, I must have meant it as some kind of metaphor, a note to future me. I didn't know that future me would one day find it at just the right moment and realize, that woman is me. I didn't leap into a new life out of rage or revenge. I simply unfolded my wings after years of keeping them hidden, and when I did, I discovered they still worked. I still get scared. I still have nights when the loneliness echoes louder than I'd like to admit. But I don't mistake that loneliness for lack anymore. I know what it's like to be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. Now, even in the quiet, I feel present. I feel whole. I think my mother knew I would get here eventually. That's why she left the shoebox. That's why she planted reminders. She wanted me to remember that erasure isn't the end of a story. It's just the pause before you start writing again, in your own voice. So if you're listening to this, and you've ever felt small, erased, unwanted, forgotten, hear me when I say this. You are not what they failed to see in you. You are not the silence they wrapped you in. You are not broken. You are becoming, and you don't need anyone else to name your worth. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you've ever felt invisible, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.